Greetings, kia ora, welcome. The session is called From the Centre. We were just discussing it, we're not quite sure why. Welcome, Yossi Alpher. People have come to hear you, not me, so I'll be brief. New Zealand historian Michael King was fond of saying that New Zealand history is as interesting as anybody's history. It may be short, it's just sped up. When we think about the Israel-Palestine conflict, it's even shorter. Today, 68 years ago, Ben-Gurion declared Israel a state. The Palestinians refer to it as the Nakba. 100 years ago, Britain and France came up with the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which divided the region up. A year after that, I think, the Balfour Declaration was signed, which promised the Jews a state. And 1 or 2 years after that, New Zealand troops invaded Gaza. And the story, in some senses, begins there, I think. But we're going to talk to Yossi. Yossi's actually seen and been involved in a huge amount of that history from a young man when he first went to Israel. He has worked for Mossad. He's a former director of the Yaffe Center for Strategic Studies in Tel Aviv, was an advisor to the Prime Minister Ehud Barak at the 2000 Camp David Summit, and he's the author of 2 recently published books, Periphery, Israel's Search for Allies in the Middle East, and No End of Conflict, Rethinking Israel-Palestine. So big welcome to Yossi, please. Yossi, you grew up in Washington, D.C. What and how did you end up in Israel?
How much time do you have?
Yeah, we'll take the brief version today.
Well, the brief version is I certainly grew up in a very political city and became interested in national and international politics at a very young age. Did not grow up in a Zionist household. And went through the usual student identity crisis in my time at Columbia University, and then came upon the Eichmann trial. We're talking 61. And one of Ben-Gurion's purposes in not only capturing Eichmann, but in staging the trial in front of the entire international media and the community, was to send a message to people like me. And I got the message. The message I got was one of secular national Jewish identity. And as I observed the Eichmann trial, I became, for the first time, aware of myself as a Jew in the national sense, and that Israel is the expression of modern Jewish nationalism, Zionism. And as a young student, felt a very strong sense of obligation to do something for the Jewish people in the aftermath of the Holocaust, and made what I can only call in the Kierkegaard sense, an existential decision that from here in, I'm an Israeli. Rather unusual Zionist story. In my case, it worked, it stuck. I simply declared this is my identity and this is where I want to live. And I have to devote a sizable portion of my life to some kind of national service in the Jewish national sense.
So you made Aliyah, you went up, as they say in Hebrew, and took up the right of return, which Jews everywhere have, to go and live in Israel.
We don't call it the right of return, we call it the law of return. And Palestinians call their demand of the 1948 refugees is called the right of return.
And we'll come to that later. You get to Israel, and I think we'll start with actually the first of your books, The Periphery Doctrine. And I don't think you've heard of it, most of us won't have heard of it, but at that point you haven't heard of it. You're working for Mossad. Tell me a bit about how you heard about it and your involvement.
Okay, I heard about it before the Mossad, because I did my military service in IDF military intelligence and found myself in a unit that liaised with the Mossad. In Israeli strategic and intelligence circles at the time, the term Periphery Doctrine, Torata Periferia, was very well known, but not beyond that. In fact, those were days when nobody knew what the Mossad was even, far away from the spotlights of the media today. I'm going to illustrate with just a few slides from my book, Periphery. We're talking about the 50s and 60s when Israel is very isolated regionally and internationally. It has very few friends. This is the challenge to explain this to New Zealanders. We are surrounded by a ring of hostile Arab countries, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Iraq, that almost daily preach the need to destroy the state of Israel. We have come out of 2 wars with those countries, the 48 War of Independence, what the Palestinians call the Nakba, and the 1956 Suez Campaign, or Sinai Campaign. And we are absolutely convinced, and I think with good reason from an intelligence standpoint, that the Arabs want another round. And it's at this time, mid-50s, that David Ben-Gurion, who was truly a strategic genius, came up with 4 grand strategies for dealing with this isolation. One of them, and they're, by the way, they're all in some way, shape, or form valid today. One is to find a great power ally. At the time, it was Britain or France. After 67, it became the United States. In 1948, it was the Soviet Union, which helped arm Israel in order for us to survive the war. A second was to mass ingathering of the exiles, at the expense of even our armed readiness. Ben-Gurion devoted huge budgets to bringing in the survivors of the Holocaust, to bringing Jews in from where they were beleaguered in Arab countries, in order to reach a kind of strategic critical, demographic critical mass. A third was developing a nuclear deterrent. And a fourth was the Periphery Doctrine. And the idea was to reach beyond the ring of hostile Arab countries beyond us, to what, from an Israelo-centric standpoint, after all, I assume New Zealand is in the center of your world maps. I don't know. Does it work that way here? I mean, most countries put themselves in the center of the maps that kids learn about in school. I don't know how you do it, but
we just fall off the bottom. We're falling off the bottom.
Okay. So from an Israeli-centric standpoint, there's a hostile ring of Arab countries around us, and we look to the periphery of the Middle East, where we see non-Arab countries or non-Muslim countries, non-Arab for Iran and Turkey, non-Muslim, for example, Ethiopia, Sudan in the mid-50s hadn't yet decided it was an Arab country, and we look to them to set up alliances, because they were also afraid of militant Arab nationalism of the Gamal Abdel Nasser variety. He was threatening them as well, and they were prepared to work with us, usually clandestinely, which is why this job was assigned to the Mossad, rather than let's say, the foreign ministry, which we never had full diplomatic relations with, is the Shah's Iran, for example. So the Mossad representative was the real ambassador. The beginning of the initial Periphery Doctrine was the Northern Triangle, which was called Trident, which lasted from the mid-50s until the fall of the Shah in 79, and a Southern Triangle, which Sudan dropped out of very quickly. But both of which left a very significant impression on our Arab neighbors, because they saw they had not succeeded in isolating us. We were not alone. With the passage of time, there developed a more easily defined southern periphery. There's a civil war in Yemen right now. One of my first jobs as a young first lieutenant in IDF intelligence before I even joined the Mossad, was to check to make sure all the Hebrew markings had been erased from weapons and ammunition that we were dropping to the Yemeni royalists, who are today the Houthis. Today they're allied with Iran. Then they were allied with the Saudis. The enemy was a Republican revolt supported by Nasser. The Russians were involved on the Republican side as well. Just an example of how this worked, how these alliances worked. A third set of alliances were with minorities, non-Arab minorities. The Kurds of northern Iraq are one case in point, and a very relatively successful one. To this day, in their semi-independence in northern Iraq, they have a warm place in their hearts for the alliance they had with Israel, because we saw ourselves as two non-Arab Middle East minorities fighting for self-determination. The fiasco of the real fiasco of the doctrine was the alliance with the Maronites in Lebanon, which led to the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, and so soured the Israeli security community on the notion of alliances with other minorities in the region that since then, I mean, we finally got out by the skin of our teeth in the year 2000, and since then we have had no such alliances with Middle East minorities, because the sense in Israel, of course the Maronites have their own narrative, but the sense in Israel is that we were betrayed by our allies. So that's it in a nutshell.
Let's talk about the Kurdish example. You, I think, had some involvement. Actually, you mentioned two things you were involved with. One was to do with the dam. Tell us about that one.
At one point, I was, by now I'm in the Mossad, fairly beginner's level, doing staff work and working opposite the Kurds, among other people. And anyone who knows the geography of northern Iraq knows that that's where the water flows south from, okay? And these are high mountains that get a lot of snow in the winter, and basically Baghdad's drinking water comes from the north. The British, when they were there after Sykes-Picot in the 20s and 30s, built an impressive set of dams to make all of this work. And the Kurds came to us and said, let's blow up the dams. That's a good way to fight the Saddam Hussein regime in Iraq. Saddam wasn't then president, but he was the power behind the throne. And it was my job to go figure out what this meant and was it possible. So I had to go and talk to people in the Israeli Water Authority who understood dams. I couldn't tell them why, although they could probably guess, and ask them. I pointed to two dams, Dirbandi Khan and Dukan. You can find them on the map today as well. One of them is kind of in creaky shape, and the U.S. has brought in some Italian experts to try to hold it together, because otherwise it really will collapse and flood Baghdad. But what I discovered is that you'll put Baghdad under a meter of water, and you will if you blow it up. You can blow it up. It's doable. And you will kill a lot of innocent people, and you will deprive Iraq of water for irrigation. And so we thought about this for a minute, and then sent a cable to the Mullah Mustafa Barazani, the Kurdish leader. Forget it. We're not going into this. That was an example of the kind of, but of course at the same time, we had throughout for a couple of decades, we had usually a 3-man mission on the ground in northern Iraq, entering thanks to our Iranian strategic allies, and always including a doctor for humanitarian aid, which is a very important part of this. and training and arming the Peshmerga, the Kurdish militia.
You mentioned in the book that there was a lot of sympathy for the Kurds, that there's a sense of brotherhood between non-Arab minorities. I found that, I can believe that that's a feeling, but if that is the case, why not the similar level of support for the Kurds, far more of them, in Turkey, or the Kurds in Iran, who are also living under awful conditions in both countries?
Oh, I mean, this is where you get into Realpolitik, okay? We could not work with the Kurds of northern Iraq if it weren't for the readiness of the Iranians to let us in. We had to enter via Iran. Iran's Kurdish issue then as now was relatively quiescent, unlike in Turkey. And it was out of the question to ask the Turks, also our allies in Trident, to let us in via Turkey, because they were much more sensitive to the Kurdish issue. And we had, I mean, look, I began by saying we're surrounded by a ring of hostile Arabs. It's not as if the people in the periphery were angels. They weren't. They had their own interests. They were not, for the most part, democratically run countries. They had huge human rights problems, including the status of their Kurds. And we had to go with the flow if we were going to in any way create a sense that we are not alone and that we have some allies on the periphery. But mind you, problematic allies.
I suppose what I'm saying is that you do make quite a play of the sense of solidarity with the Kurds of Iraq. And if that was real, because, I mean, do you think the Kurds of Iraq were better off for those types of military operations that were going on? I mean, there were Kurds in Iraq who also supported the regime. It's not as if it was a one-sided conflict, even between the Kurds. I mean, really, does anyone benefit from that level of military support in those types of situations?
Look, let me focus on two cases which, from the Israeli standpoint, in retrospect, were positive experiences. One was the Kurds of northern Iraq. The other was the animists and Christians of South Sudan. Okay, in both cases, they were horribly persecuted by the Arab leaderships of their country in Baghdad and Khartoum, respectively. I mean, we saw later on Saddam Hussein using chemical weapons on the Kurds. They were horribly persecuted. Yes, they were riven by their own schisms and conflicting loyalties. They had no past history of behaving like a sovereign or semi-sovereign people aspiring to sovereignty, but they were genuinely suffering. And our relationship with the Kurds began when then head of the Mossad, Meir Amit, this is in the early 60s, meets with a Kurdish representative in Paris and comes back and says to Golda Meir, who was then foreign minister, he says, look, these people don't have enough money to make themselves a cup of tea. And Golda says, take $100,000. And $100,000 for Israel at that time was a lot of money. All right? And give them something. Now, given the fact that we are in a permanent war with our Arab neighbors, there's a natural sympathy for other peoples in the region who are also in permanent war with their Arab neighbors, and who don't even have the luxury of all these Realpolitik considerations of do I help the Israelis, do I not help the Israelis? But they came to us in a very genuine way, saying, look, you Jews have achieved self-determination in your historic homeland in the middle of the Arab world. All right? We want the same thing. We deserve the same thing. Will you help us? And we had good reason to help them.
And so the Kurds of Turkey, because Turkey is more important to you as a peripheral nation, wouldn't get the same treatment. To the best
of my recollection, the Kurds of Turkey never even came to us, nor did the Kurds of Iran. But yes, Turkey was more important because Turkey is a strategic ally threatened Syria. Let me just take you back here for a minute. It's rather interesting, whereas the relationship with Iran in the 60s and 70s was warmer and had a lot more intelligence and strategic cooperation content, it was with Turkey, with whom we found ourselves discussing on several occasions launching a joint war against Syria. Now, you see, Turkey is to Syria's north, Israel is to the south. This reached operational planning stages. And again in the 90s, after the end of the Periphery Doctrine, when Israel had far more far-reaching regional reach, and could dialogue with Arab countries from the core as well as peripheral countries. Once again, the Turks were prepared to talk to us about a joint military operation against Syria. That never happened with Iran. But yes, in this case, you have no choice. These are your neighbors. These are the people you're dealing with. You have to ignore not only their Kurds, something much harder for Israelis to do, and that's to bow to the Turkish demand that we not make a fuss over the Armenian genocide, which to this day is a hot-button issue in Israel.
In fact, when you had conferences in Jerusalem, you uninvited Armenians and didn't let them attend, even though the word genocide was coined to describe exactly their experience.
You're quite right. It was and is a hot-button issue. It's much easier today, given the nature of the government in Turkey under Erdogan. It's in effect a kind of Turkish version of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's less friendly toward Israel, but nevertheless, there are huge considerations when it comes to little Armenia, sandwiched between Turkey, a former and maybe future ally on the one hand, and Azerbaijan, which is part of our new periphery allies, and an important country because it borders on Iran.
When you're supporting an insurgent group within a country, isn't it inevitable that the Arabs of Iraq, whether they despise Saddam or not, would come to the conclusion that Israel is a hostile country that simply is not interested in peace? I mean, you yourself were involved in successfully blowing up oil. I mean, you helped the Kurds blow up an oil well, I believe. The natural response of ordinary people must be to think of Israel as simply a hostile country in the region.
Look, you're pointing to a kind of vicious circle here. Israel reached out to the periphery. Periphery countries like Turkey and Iran, the minorities reached out to us, but we reached out to the periphery because of Arab hostility. Because war after war, they would not come to terms with the existence of Israel. We're making preparations constantly for the next war. We're talking about an era in which South Al-Arab, the Nasser's radio station in Cairo, daily broadcasts throw the Jews into the sea. Now, yes, when I'm writing the Periphery book, and I now have access to Arab countries, I can talk to Egyptians, I can talk to Jordanians, even Saudis and Syrians and Lebanese, and I asked them, well, what did you think of this Periphery Doctrine? They said, yes, well, it just drove home what we were saying, our own narrative, which was that you're hostile. You're a hostile implant in the region, and you're being all the more hostile by making common cause with our enemies. So there was a vicious circle here. But let me just, if I may, jump to the conclusion, okay? Because there were Israelis who pointed to exactly what you said and said Periphery Doctrine is a mistake. We have to be reaching out to our Arab neighbors. In talking to these same Arab neighbors and Arab strategic thinkers and writers decades later, and hearing, yes, this made you more hostile, but the conversation would lead me inevitably to the conclusion that the periphery relationships persuaded them that they can't beat us and that they're going to have to come to terms with us. And I make the argument that the real success of the periphery relationship is sending that deterrent message to the extent that a leader, a very fine strategic thinker like Egyptian President Anwar Sadat came to the conclusion he's going to have to find a way to get along with us. So it contributed ultimately to peace.
Those of us who follow this closely, one of the difficulties is, maybe I don't follow it closely enough, is the claim and counterclaim. So your claim now that NASA said daily to throw the Jews into the sea, in the early 70s, a British politician offered a reward to anyone who could find a direct quote of NASA saying that. He didn't end up paying out. You say in the book yourself, before NASA, admittedly, but that in 1948, Egypt said it would recognize Israel if, and it was a big if, I think they wanted a portion of the Negev.
What year are you talking about?
You're talking 48. It's in your book. Syria, I think in 49, says they'll take 300 refugees, 300,000 refugees, and they want half of the Galilee. So there are these things going forward. Writing just today, I think Yossi Alpher, the old man of the Israeli peace movement, actually fought against NASA. He recounts a story of NASA 7 years before Sadat, making it known that he was prepared to basically have that same agreement. So we get these, it is difficult having these things, but it certainly looks, or some people claim, who seem well connected, that the Arabs were trying to come to compromises.
In return for half the Galilee and half the Negev, thank you very much. We said, we never even agreed to dialogue with them about this. But look,
just on that, one of the parts of Israeli historiography is they say, look, we accepted partition.
Israel accepted.
Yeah, we accepted partition. Well, at that point, saying half the Negev or some of the Galilee, if the Palestinians, who made up 1.5 million people against 500 Jewish immigrants in 1947, were expected to take less than half of the land, then it's not unreasonable to say that that was also a missed opportunity in 1948.
Look, we can go on and on. There are different versions of the history. As someone whose formative professional years were spent in the intelligence community, I believe very strongly that Arab hostility was Arab hostility. They didn't want us around. They could not come to terms with us. And they believed it was possible to get rid of us in one way or another. That's the Ben-Gurion school, if you like. There were other schools of thought. Moshe Sharet, who thought he could dialogue with the Arabs and reach different outcomes. I'm looking at the Periphery Doctrine, which is something I worked with very intensely, believing very strongly that this was contributing to Israel's security by sending a strong deterrent message. And I think maybe I can illustrate it, if I may, with one additional anecdote. July 4th, 1976, the Entebbe operation, which the older members of the audience presumably remember because it was known worldwide. An Air France plane taking off from Tel Aviv had been hijacked, and the hijackers were from the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a Marxist Palestinian organization, in cahoots with Idi Amin of Uganda, who used to be our periphery buddy and had turned against us, landed the plane at the Entebbe airport in Uganda. I was involved in this, and my involvement was, at the same time, there was a meeting of the Organization of African States in Mauritius. And I was there undercover, not as an Israeli, but as someone else from Western origins, observing what was going on as a journalist. And when the news came across, was broadcast by the BBC on July 4th, that Israeli commandos had rescued all of the hostages, killed the hostage takers, and were flying back to Israel, I realized my job now is to go talk to the Arab representatives, Arab countries in Africa, from Egypt to Morocco, and what's their reaction? Get very fresh reactions from them. And I went first to talk to the Moroccans. Now, Morocco is not on any of my maps. It's just too far to the west to appear there, but it was a periphery ally. And I approached some Moroccan diplomats who presumably have nothing to do with the strategic clandestine relationship with Israel. I say, have you heard about Entebbe? No. I relate to them what happened. And I said, what's your response? And they say to me, you have any Israeli friends? I said, a few. And they say, well, tell them, well done. We applaud what they did. I then go to the Egyptian delegation, much more important from the terms of Israel's overall strategic interests. And it's a delegation of generals, all in uniform. They hadn't heard either. And I tell this to them, and they are in a state of total shock. This is 3 years after the Yom Kippur War, which, according to their narrative, then as now, they won. And they simply couldn't believe the Israelis could strike in the heart of Africa, and Uganda is the heart of Africa, the sources of the Nile, the sustenance of Egypt, and pull off an operation like this. And when I got back to Mossad headquarters in Tel Aviv, I was called in by the head of the Mossad, General Haka, and he says, well, tell me, what did you hear after the operation? And I told this to them, and he said, okay, the Moroccans know our capabilities. The Egyptians thought they won the last war, and they can't believe that we could do a thing like this, and this will have a profound effect on their strategic calculations. It was a matter of about a year later that Sadat took the initiative, and of course he knew that we were already in secret negotiations with Egypt, with Sadat's people. And within a year, we were making peace with Sadat. I have no doubt whatsoever that the way we could exploit our ties in the periphery, and in this case it meant with Ethiopia and with Kenya, in order to pull off an operation like that, influence Egyptian calculations about coexistence with Israel. So in my view, and whether you buy into the Ben-Gurion approach or the Sharet approach, in my view, the ability to broadcast to our neighbors that we have powerful friends indeed sitting on the sources of the Nile River, made a very positive contribution to whatever modicum of peace and strategic cooperation we've established with our neighbors. And I say modicum because it's far from what one would call the normalization.
We could talk for a lot more on this topic. I think we'll shift gear and talk more about the Israel-Palestine aspect.